I want to start off by just saying thank you all for attending today's session. I know it's been a long couple days, so I really appreciate you all taking the time to be here. I'm so excited to be here with Zillow and the rest of my team for a 300-level talk about how Zillow uses AWS security services to build a secure perimeter. Before we get started, my name is Shivani Sharma. I'm an AWS Senior Account Manager for Zillow. I have with me from the AWS side, AWS Senior Security Consultant for Global Security Services, Dhamindra Bandra. I'm Principal Security Specialist, Moon Hussain. And from the Zillow side, I have with me on stage, Principal Security Architect, Joshua McKitty. I'm really excited to have Zillow here today. Everyone here is probably familiar with Zillow. I know I am, as I'm spending my weekend scrolling and scheduling tours through Zillow while I'm looking to be a first-time home buyer and buy my first property in Washington. Zillow is the most visited real estate website in the United States. Zillow and its affiliates offer customers an on-demand experience for selling, buying, renting, and financing by providing an end-to-end experience. They are helping their customers search for home and unlock life's next chapter. Today, we'll hear from Josh on how Zillow implemented a solution that protects all lines of businesses and brands at Zillow through AWS security offerings. Today, we'll be focused on how Zillow uses security services to build a secure perimeter. The agenda will be starting off with Josh on Zillow's journey, strategy, and use case, moving to Dhamindra on WAF fine-tuning and a demo. We'll talk through lessons learned, and Moon will go through advanced inspections, and I will talk about how to get started and calls to actions. Cool? Great. Now I'll be handing it over to Josh to talk about how Zillow used AWS security services to build a secure perimeter.
Thank you, Shivani. Everybody still help me okay? Just making sure. All right, perfect. So as Shivani stated, to recap, at Zillow, we provide various real estate services across multiple brands throughout the United States. With that, we have a large content distribution for our customers who are searching for homes and unlocking life's next chapter. And so with that, we needed a solution that protected all of our various brands and content with a standard rule set, along with being both scalable and flexible to match variances in our brands. So real quick, let's take a look at the AWS WAF architecture. So when we set up AWS WAF using AWS Firewall Manager, we use AWS Firewall Manager for deploying the WAF to our content resources. In doing so, we used a tag-based deployment to allow teams to add to manage rules we created at times where customer impact for those brands were minimal to their services. This included policies for both observation and tuning using count for the action. And then promoting those to policies to enforce. And that could be block, sometimes capture, or challenge as well. And so these are some of the top AWS managed WAF rules that were beneficial for Zillow and its brands. I want to highlight kind of the top two on this list. The anonymous IP list, which contains IPs that obfuscate the users or requesters' identity. For example, things like VPN, or if you're using proxy traffic. And then also the Amazon IP reputation list, which is based off of Amazon's internal threat intelligence. So as Zillow listings are popular with our customers, if you're looking for your actual next house, or you're a landlord, or you're looking to rent, or if you're just Zillow stalking, and I'm sure we all have done it, as Shivani said, as I do as well. We also receive traffic from sources that are not legitimate. And with that, when we implemented these top two rules in particular, we actually saw a performance increase in our services due to receiving the traffic that we want without the traffic that we don't. And this included a combination of actions, not just block. Block was included, but it was also captures and challenges as well. A lot of those events on observation were also triggering some of the other AWS managed rule sets that are in this slide here. So when we saw that, we were able to get alerts that were high fidelity and worthy for deeper investigation. So let's take a look at how we performed the analysis on the AWS WAF logs. So for the setup of that, we use the pattern leveraging cold storage and SQL queries behind Amazon S3 and Amazon Athena. And when our resources get tagged and have the WAF added to them, those logs get sent through a defined Kinesis fire hose via the firewall manager to a centralized S3 bucket. And then either during tuning activities or if there's actual security investigation, we use standard queries to parse the logs and perform the analysis. And so this is a sample of, or example of a query we would use to review the AWS WAF logs. Just walking through it, like at the beginning, I'm performing an unnest for one of the fields. If you're looking at these logs raw, the rule group list field specifically within those logs is a very long JSON payload. And so unnesting it just makes it a bit cleaner for us to query very standard. There's another field, the HTTP request field, and I'm querying that here too. It's also a long a long JSON payload that I didn't unnest here, but that's something that we would commonly unnest to just make the queries a little bit cleaner. From there, I'm looking for the specific action, whether that's block, allow, captcha again, what rule name it's hitting, and the IP. I'm then taking the records, the total, and then grouping them and showing the number of each entry by the query that I've defined. And then I'm limiting my query to 1 day to make the query more efficient. And also so I don't just look at the entire set of logs. That would be a lot. And then finally, I'm ordering to see the highest number of requests. The goal with this particular query to see is what rule is getting hit the most and where from. One thing to note is there's a step here that's not being shown if you're using this for the first time, and that's where you set up or create a table that you'll use for performing the queries with the logs. There are several examples out there of how to set up a table. This one in particular, specifically, we use partition projection with our table creation and use the month, the year, and the day, actually in the hour for the partitions. And that allows us to query for results within a specific time, as you'll see in the where clause. And so this is a sample of output from a previous query. From this, what I can do is I can validate that the rules are working as intended, perform additional tuning for unexpected or unwanted behavior, or use these as metrics to evaluate the tool efficiency. With that, I'm going to hand over to Damendra to talk more about fine-tuning the AWS WAF.
Thanks, Josh. Now, you started building your WAF solution with AWS WAF, and you selected some managed WAF rules based on your requirements. The next thing you need to do is to see whether your WAF solution works as you expected and do any fine-tuning as needed. So when we configure the WAF solution for the CloudFront distribution for Zillow, as all of you would expect, our expectation is that all the unauthorized requests to get denied by the managed WAF rules, and allow all the authorized users to access our services without any problem. However, in reality, when we build a WAF solution, you will start seeing some legitimate requests getting blocked, which we call false positives, and also we see some unauthorized requests still bypassing WAF and penetrating to your services, which we call false negatives. So it's important that when you fine-tune your WAF solution in a non-production environment before you really put it to production to reduce the false positives and false negatives and increase the accuracy of detection. So in the next section of my presentation, I'll explain to you what we did with Zillow to handle false positives and false negatives. Starting with false negatives, these are unauthorized requests that are allowed by the managed WAF rule groups. So managed WAF rule groups in general are developed based on common vulnerability signatures. So it's common that there are some requirements or some signatures that we expect to get blocked are not get blocked by the WAF solution. So to identify these gaps, we performed a penetration test where we identified the test cases based on our requirements and performed this request against our WAF solution, which we have an identical solution which we deployed in a non-production environment, and we tested our WAF rules against these tests. So using the penetration test, we looked at how effective our managed WAF rule groups we selected, and we decided what additional customizations that we need to do. Next, moving to false positives. These are the legitimate traffic that are getting blocked by the managed WAF rule groups. And as I explained before, the managed WAF rule groups are developed based on the common vulnerability signatures. So it's based on how your application works. It's common that there are some legitimate traffic that can get blocked by the managed WAF rule groups. So to identify that, again, we do all this testing in the non-production environment because we don't want to do anything in the production environment and get your users blocked while we are doing this testing and fine-tuning. So we did all this testing in the non-production environment. And in the non-production environment, we started our WAF rules in the count mode, which is the monitoring mode for WAF. So it's not really blocking any request, but still log. In your logs, you will still see that this particular request triggered this WAF rule. And we ran in the non-production environment in count mode for a couple of days, like 2 to 3 days. And then we analyzed the WAF logs to identify what rules are getting counted. Then we identified what rules with confidence that we can put to block mode without really impacting or blocking our legitimate traffic. Then once we identify what rules are getting blocked or counted here, we wanted to make sure whether they are legitimate unauthorized requests or false positives. So understanding or identifying false positives requires a deep knowledge about the application itself. So to understand the false positives, we work closely with the application teams, Zillow application teams in this case, and work with them to identify these blocked requests are legitimate blocks, or it's blocking legitimate users, or it's real unauthorized requests. So once we did this process in the non-production environment, then we started doing some testing in the production. We moved the rules to the production environment and ran it again. Still, we started in the count mode because we wanted to make sure we don't miss any legitimate traffic that are getting blocked, are not identified in non-production environment, and some legitimate users getting blocked in the production environment. So we still started in the count mode, but now we knew like what are we looking for and what customizations we need to do. So we already did that in the non-production, but we test everything in the count mode in the production environment. Did the test for another 2-3 days and analyze the logs. And once we are very confident with that rules are not getting generating false positives, we put those rules first to the block mode. Then once we identified the false positives, we wanted to make sure whether we can narrow it down. For example, we don't either we need to put the particular rule within the rule group fully to the count mode, or whether we can narrow it down to a particular URI or a particular pattern. Again, I'm talking a lot of these technical things here. I'm going to do a demo in a coming slide, and I'll show you how to do. So for right now, just try to understand the high-level process, but you will actually see how you can do it in your real environment when I do the demo. Then for the Zillow, so we looked at the false positives that were generating, and with that, with the scale and complexity of the Zillow website, and also with looked at the false positives that were generating, the rules that were generating false positives, it made sense for us to put the complete rule into the count mode, and without narrow it down. But again, as I said, when you really do it, it's in your environment. Have a look at that and see whether there's a possibility to narrow it down to more like particular smaller portions, like particular URIs or signatures. So once we do this and do that, we put the rules that we are confident to block and some rules to capture mode, like IP reputation list, we put it in the capture mode, and then left the other rules in the count mode. Now that we fine-tune our WAF rules, and our WAF rules are in block mode in the production environment, we still need to analyze your WAF logs, keep monitoring WAF logs. There's two reasons for that. The main reason is identifying new false positives. So when we deploy the WAF solution for Zillow, we did the manage WAF rules in the default mode, which is when the WAF rules are in default mode, the WAF rules get updated in the backend. Like when a new signature comes, the WAF rules will automatically get updated. So which is great when you start having your WAF solution, because then you don't have to worry about adding additional rules or adding your own customizations, because now the rules will get automatically updated based on this new vulnerability signatures. However, this comes with a risk, because now the WAF rules are getting updated in the backend, so it could introduce new false positives. That is why when you use the WAF rules, manage WAF rules in the default mode, always you have to keep monitoring your logs to identify if it is generating new false positives and handle them accordingly. In addition, it's also important to identify the threat patterns and anomalies in the block request as well as in the count request to see whether what kind of requests really getting blocked, so whether we need any customizations. Also look at the count requests or to see whether there are some additional customizations we can do to narrow down the exposure of our resources. Now, we talked about fine-tuning WAF. Let's look at some custom rule writing. For the first example, I'm going to talk about how we handle false positives. So as I explained before, for Zillow, we didn't really go into creating these exceptions, but this is, I wanted to show you when you really start developing our handling false positives, how you can really create some exceptions using AWS WAF to handle your false positives. So for this demo, I'm going to show you how you can create an exception for handling false positives in your AWS WAF using AWS WAF. So assume you have like CloudFront distribution or something, and you want to protect your application from cross-site scripting. This is a common vulnerability. I think most of you might be aware. Cross-site scripting is a vulnerability where you inject a JavaScript or some kind of a script to your web application to perform some unauthorized activity. So say you want to block cross-site scripting. So you started with AWS Manage WAF rules and added the AWS Manage common rule set. And and once you do that, you start seeing blocks, legitimate blocks, as well as some false positives. And for this example, assume that you are seeing false positives. So I've created a sample web application with a sample CloudFront distribution, which has a couple of pages. Assume that for sample page.php, this page, the blocks that you see are false positives. So let's see how we can handle it using AWS WAF for cross-site scripting in query argument. So this demo, I created a sample web application firewall called demo WAF, and I associated the CloudFront distribution I created with these web application firewall, and I included the AWS Manage common rule set. So AWS Managed Common Rule Set provides the protection for cross-site scripting, for cookies, query arguments, body, and URI path. So after I add that, so it will provide, you will get the protection for cross-site scripting for these HTTP paths. Now, if you go a little up, you see this section called labels. Labels is a method to provide communication between rules. For example, when a rule get triggered, rule within the rule group get triggered, it will generate this label, which you can use in a WAF rule after that. So, and you look at that, each label has the rule group name as well as the rule name, and you see here the core rule set cross-site scripting query argument. Now let's go to my web application. So you see my sample page.php. I can access that, and I have a few more pages. It's very simple web application. A simple web server I created. So now I'm going to inject a JavaScript as part of the query argument. And you see it is getting blocked because we have the common rule set with cross-site scripting query argument rule, and it is blocking this JavaScript here. And say, as for the example, let's say for example page.php, the blocks we are getting are false positives, and let's see how we can handle this using AWS WAF. Okay, so let's go to our web application firewall, go to rules, and I'm going to first put the rule that is generating false positive to count mode, because first we have to stop that rule from blocking the requests. So once you do that, it's not going to block your traffic anymore for the cross-site scripting query arguments. However, it's still going to generate that label that we are going to use in the next rule that we are going to create, the custom rule, to create this exception here. So I'm going to create a custom rule using rule builder, give a name, cross-site scripting exception, select a regular rule, and I'm going to create a rule which has two components combined with end. For the first part, I'm going to use the label that was generated from that rule in the count mode. Let's search for cross-site scripting query arguments. And for the next part, I'm going to create the exception. So we are going to create the exception for the URI path. And give content string, and I'm going to give sample page.php. And always make sure to negate that, because we want to only allow that particular path but block everything else. And we have it in the action in the block, and I add the rule and save it. And always make sure your custom rule comes after your managed rule group, because managed rule is the one that is generating that label that we used in our custom rule here. So the priority should be lower for the custom rule. So now let's go back to our web server. And you see, for example, page.php, and I tried the same script, and you were able to access it. But for the other pages, like sample page1.php, or we can do, for example, page2.php, you can see this is getting blocked. So it's, and this is like a very simple example, and you can enhance, do more customization, more granular rules using WAF, AWS WAF custom rule writing. And if you want to try this, at the end of the presentation, we will share a QR code, and I've created a sample CloudFormation template that you can deploy that and test it. So as a call to action, we encourage you to test this and see how you can really build a very simple rule to handle false positives. So now let's look at a couple of other rules that we deployed for Zillow. One is geo-based rate limiting. So the use case here is the majority of the Zillow users, users are US based. So we wanted to have some throttling for requests outside US. So we create some rate limit to throttle the requests outside US, but still allowing the request coming from the US users to allow the access the services without any throttling. Let's look at how it is done. You see, it's again a custom rule. I created a custom rule which used the geo-based rule statement. And we created, when you create the custom rule, I select it to be a rate-based rule and set the rate limit. These are not the exact rate limits. I've just selected some values just for an example. And create this cop down statement. Again, I'm doing the negation here because I want to have this rate limit for everything except US. So I'm going to say not US and have this rate limit. And this is an example. We have recently added more granular rate-based rule creation in AWS WAF as well. So the way how it works is, like previously, what we did for Zillow is the geo rate limiting at the country level. But if you really want to do it at more granular level, like a region level, you can, AWS WAF provide the capability to do that. So the way you do that is first you create a geomesh rule, like the one we explained before. Geomesh rule, but now you have to create it in the count mode. So what it's going to do is, like once it's in the count mode, and when a request get hit with this rule in the count mode, it's going to generate a label that can consist ISO 316's country and region codes. And you can use this label to create the custom rule. So this is the example you can see here. So what I'm saying is, if I has this label which says AWS WAF, client IP, and geo is region, US Oregon, then it will get blocked. Or either way, here I'm saying if it's not US Oregon, to block. So you can do it at more granular level using these labels and this feature that's added to AWS WAF. Now I'm going to hand over to Josh to talk about some lessons learned from doing this WAF experiment with WAF implementation for Zillow.
Thank you, Dimendra. And so some of the lessons learned for us were to start with promotion tactics to implement the rules. This includes starting with placing the rules in an action of count, performing the analysis of the logs, and baselining the unwanted and wanted traffic. And then finally, promoting to your desired action, whether it be block, challenge, or capture. Afterwards, you want to review your rule set and baseline any block traffic on a regular cadence that fits your business model and capacity. And then finally, and arguably the most important part, broad communication to your teams and leadership. This can be a breaking change. So ensuring that you're transparent with everyone involved is paramount for a successful implementation. So with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Moon to talk about some of the more advanced inspections.
Thank you, Josh. All right, well, thank you, Josh and Dimendra. So that gave you some highlights into how customers are actually adopting AWS WAF. So the 4 boxes that you see, we covered 3 of them. The intent of my presentation, which will take about 5 to 6 minutes, will cover the 4th box. So we went over the implementation of managed rules. So this is when you're alarming on policy violations. And then the next step of the customer journey is to customize what you have in your environment. So it can be based on geo-blocking, it can be based on adding certain types of scope down statements, and so on and so forth. The 3rd box that you have over there is not the detect portion, but rather the protect portion. So what you want to do, as you heard earlier, is use false positive reduction techniques to ensure that you're not blocking legitimate traffic. So what you want to do here is put it in the monitoring mode, where you look at certain types of counts, then you reduce the false positives, you tune your AWS WAF, and when you have a comfortable stance of putting it into the protect mode, and then you sort of convert over from monitor to protect. So now you are blocking stuff, adding captures, and also in a way that you're reducing false positives, so you're not disrupting legitimate traffic. Now, the fourth box that you see over here is a transitions that customers take in terms of going from normal WAF activities to taking advanced inspections into account. And these advanced inspections can be based on fraud protection or bot protection. So in the interest of time, I will be covering bot protection for this session. But before we do that, it's important to understand what is a bot. Now, there are two types of bots. There are good bots, there are bad bots. So as the name implies, the good bots, they help with productivity enhancements that you absolutely need to do. So simple functions, for example, search engine crawling, vulnerability scanning are things that good bots do. So you definitely want to utilize that. What you will find in terms of the traits that good bots have is that A, they're not stealthy. They self-identify. They self-rate limit. They also use API in a very legitimate fashion. In contrast to bad bots that you absolutely want to eliminate, they are different. They are stealthy in nature. They have traits where they try to obscure themselves. They test the limits of the applications, and they have the ability to abuse APIs, all of which you want to eliminate. So with that, let's understand, first of all, the impact of these bots. Now, when you look at the impact of the bad bots, they can be twofold. One is related to infrastructure types of attacks, and the other one related to application attacks. When you look at infrastructure attacks, these are attacks that are targeting your infrastructure or the underlying hardware. And the ramifications of these attacks is that it can cause things like downtime. It will require some manual intervention. There will be lost income coming out of it. In contrast to application attacks that, as the name suggests, targets your application. So when that happens, you could have things like stolen data or compromised credentials, which will result to negative PR for your organization. So with that, how does AWS WAF help this process? So we'll be focusing more on targeted bots, but just to highlight common bots. So as we noted earlier, common bots are ones that identify themselves. So we can actually deploy signatures that look for certain pattern matching techniques, such that if you see an anomaly, you can alert and you can take response actions based on that. Additionally, we can also inspect request headers. So we can see some malicious code in request headers as well that we need to look out for. And then lastly, we also want to look at the IP reputation of the source to ensure that it is not a nefarious source, and also do things like reverse DNS lookups to ensure that we have a good understanding that the source is legitimate. Now, for targeted bots, totally different story. With targeted bots, they do not self-identify. They are very stealthy in nature. So there are some additional techniques that need to be performed in order to detect these stealthy bots and protect these stealthy bots from these stealthy bots. So one is the behavioral-based detection techniques. You want to be able to baseline what is normal behavior and then identify what is abnormal based on that baseline. The other thing is browser fingerprinting, browser interrogation, things that you want to highlight as well. So if you drill down to targeted bots, there are 4 key techniques that we use. One is the challenge token check. The other one is the request volume check, and we'll get into all of these in a moment. The other one is the browser automation framework check, and then the last one is the browser inconsistency check. So looking at the first one first, the challenge token check. So what you'll find is that a lot of bots, what they try to do is have requests across multiple sessions and a range of IP addresses. So you won't detect them. Essentially, it's not coming from the same source. So what we do is we look for a threshold such that if we see that occurrence, let's say 4 or 5 times, we will present what we refer to as a challenge token. And this challenge token will require the source to perform some kind of JavaScript action. Essentially, what we're trying to do is make it difficult for the source so as to differentiate whether the source is a bot or a human. So if this challenge action goes through according to plan, then what we will do is gather more information about the browser, do some browser fingerprinting and things like that to get a little more information about what's going on behind the scenes. However, if they do not pass the challenge, what's going to happen is that they will be blocked. So that leads us to the next detection technique, which is the anomalous request volume check. And this is simply related to ML technology, where you can baseline what is legitimate behavior in terms of request volumes, in terms of sources and things like that. Once you baseline that normal volume, if you see a spike that is aberrant to that normal volume, you have an indication that it is a telltale sign of bot activity taking place. So our ability to understand those anomalies is huge, and the fact that we can have a capture that is a response action that allows us to tell if it's a human behind the scenes or a bot behind the scenes is an additional response capability that we have in the product. Browser automation framework checks. So what are these? So when you're creating a bot, there are browser automation frameworks that are typically used. Things like Selenium, Puppeteer, Phantom.js, these are all examples. So in that challenge action that we discussed earlier, where we are trying to examine the traffic and figure out what's going on, we also have insight into characteristics that these different automation techniques use. So we can detect whether or not these automation frameworks are being used. If they are, obviously that is akin to bot activity. In this case, we can also have a rule action of a capture where we can differentiate between human and bot activity. And the very last one is the browser inconsistency check. So what do we want to do here? So what attackers try to do is they realize that there are certain types of browsers that are commonly used for this types of activities that the customer might be detecting and mitigating and disallowing the browser activity altogether. So they will masquerade as Safari, but they could be running on a Windows box, for example, which is a mismatch. So our service will actually pick up these mismatches and give us some indication of browser inconsistency based on this interrogation. And as is the case with the other actions, we will also have a rule action to throw up a capture to differentiate between those activities. And with that, hopefully that provides you a good information about the advanced inspection techniques, and I will hand it back to Shivani.
Awesome. Thank you three for providing insight on Zillow's strategy to build a secure perimeter, sharing demo, and the journey for WAF adoption. For this next section, I will be sharing how this engagement came into place with Zillow and how any of you can replicate it with your projects and company. But first, I want to start off with the live poll. If you guys can all take out your phones, scan the QR code. This question will really help me understand better understanding of the room's engagement with AWS teams and partners and pro serves that you've worked with in the past. That way I can really customize what is the most applicable for all of you. So I will give you about, I'll say like 10 more seconds to go on ahead and scan the QR code, submit which of the following groups you've worked with, and then we will have the results shown on the screen in about like 5 seconds. Awesome. All right. Cool. Well, it looks like we have a range of kind of all of them. Oh, looks like things are shifting as we speak. A lot of AWS account team, ProServe partners, and none of the above. So get a wide range of all the different options. I will be going through all 4 of them because it looks like we got a diverse range of people who have kind of engaged with all of them, which is awesome, to help you understand how you can get started and maybe some resources you haven't utilized in the past. Going back to the slide. Perfect. Now, when it comes to where you can start with this engagement, or really any of the engagements you've heard here at AWS, there are 3 different areas of support that you have to consider when it comes to your team's projects. 1 is going to be self-service, 2 partners and ProServe, 3 AWS account team. Things to consider is what is your team's timeline, and 2, what is your team's expertise. Self-service, this is where your team is full-on builders and have full of control of how often and what you're building. You really will be leveraging AWS documentations, trainings, and our blogs for education how to get started. So if you're watching this session and you're ready to get started the second you walk out of the doors, this one is for you. Partner and ProServe, when you have a shortage of maybe a skilled resource or maybe an Excel timeline of a project you're trying to get done, AWS, ProServe, professional services, and partners help accelerate your business outcomes by leading you through the business and technical work streams you have set for you, your team, and your company. If you're watching this session and your team might have an Excel timeline or need some extra expertise, this option is for you. And lastly, AWS account team. See this resource as your navigator or really as an extension of your team on all technical and business projects. Their success is your success and are aligned to helping you navigate the different options for AWS. Sometimes trying to figure out where to start can be a lot, and the AWS account team is going to be kind of your left and right hand to tell you, like, here are your different options, here is how you can get started. If any of you who submitted the poll might not know who your AWS account team is, you can actually just go on our AWS website and our Contact Us form and request to be introduced to your account manager to get started. Now that I've talked to you all through what your options are, what does that actually look like, and what does that actually mean? On the screen, you will see a visual of the highlights, kind of the different options of what each of the options entail and what they include. Self-service, like I said, you really get access to our AWS training, your team, and our documentation. AWS account team, you get access to partner and ProServe. Partner and ProServe. You will be access to your team, training and documentation, and introduction to partner and ProServe to see how you want to move forward. And then lastly, AWS account team. This is going to be kind of your navigator to help get access to get started. And you get access to a solutions architect. So your account team can help you find your partner, find the ProServe, engage you with ProServe, architecture reviews, or a 300, 400 level deep dive, or organize an immersion day along with your team, which will be a day-long in-person or virtual engagement that the SA will help create to excel your adoption of the service. Now, for Zillow, what made this engagement successful is we were closely aligned throughout kind of the process. As one of their account managers, AWS and Zillow engaged in understanding what their end goal was to build their strategy. We had close communication, weekly syncs, and helped find the right way to get started on this engagement and got them connected to ProServe based on Zillow's timelines and needs. What made this engagement successful is a collaboration with AWS and Zillow with communication and sharing kind of the end goal and really utilizing us as their navigator and an extension of their team. Awesome. To conclude, I really want to just share a few call to actions. Now that we have shared how to configure AWS WAF with managed rules, with WAF rules and some custom WAF rules, here are some things you can do to get familiarized with AWS WAF. If you want to scan the QR code, you can get access to the CloudFormation template that Demindra shared with the customer rules we discussed with the QR provided. So I will let any of you who want to scan the code for about like 3 more seconds, and then I'll wait until I see all the phones down, and then I'll move. So I'm not rushing you guys. All right. Cool. Additionally, here are some other resources available for you and your teams the second you walk out of the door. Again, applicable for this session, but also all the different sessions you've heard throughout Reinforce. AWS has tons of resources from our AWS blogs on WAF, perimeter strategy. You can leverage your AWS team to get started. If you aren't familiar with the AWS account team, like I said, go on our website, our contact us form, and feel free to submit a request to be introduced, and you can get an introduction through there. AWS training, we have AWS Skills Builder. It's incredible. I use it all the time, and it is our digital training resource where you and your teams will have access to 500 on-demand courses and learning plans. So let's say you walk out of this session and you really want to have a follow-up 300-level training on WAF and tons of other enablement. Skills Builder will be able to provide that for all of you. Deep dives and immersion days, another option. This can be supported with leveraging your account team and can help schedule a deep dive or an immersion day for further enablement. As you can see, there's tons to do. Great. I want to thank you all for your time today. That does conclude our session. 3 asks from our end is, 1, feel free to come up at the end in the hallway to ask any questions. We're happy to help in any way. 2, your feedback is crucial to us. I know you all have heard it throughout Inforce. If you could please take 10 seconds on the mobile app to leave feedback. We literally will go through every single piece of feedback and apply it moving forward, what worked, what didn't work, and would love to hear from all of you so we can continue to improve. And 3, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn to continue the conversation. And then most importantly, enjoy the rest of Inforce, safe travels, and thank you all for being an AWS customer.